The grand conclave hall of Verath Prime was unlike anything humans had ever built. The ceiling arched hundreds of meters above the floor, lined with soft panels of shifting light that changed color to match the home star of whoever was speaking. And on the walls curved inward in a perfect circle around a central floor made of deep black stone that had been quarried from a moon that no longer existed. Every seat in that circle was filled. 41 species sat in their designated sections, some with 4 arms, some with none, then some that floated in sealed liquid tanks mounted on hovering platforms, and every single one of them was watching the small human woman who stood alone at the center of the floor. Her name was Ambassador Sarah Voss, 62 years old, born in Lagos to a family of lawyers and engineers, trained by the UN Interstellar Affairs Division for 3 decades. And she had been selected for this mission not because she was the most decorated diplomat Earth had ever produced, but because she was the most difficult one to rattle. She wore no ceremonial robes, no species badge, no decorative sash, nothing that could be read as either a plea for respect or a performance of power. Just a clean, dark suit, flat shoes, and a small silver datapad held loosely in her left hand. The council had a tradition of beginning hearings in complete silence, a deliberate quiet meant to communicate the weight of what was being decided, and Sarah had been standing in that spot for 40 minutes before anyone spoke. She spent those 40 minutes looking slowly around the hall, studying each delegation with the calm and patient attention of someone who is gathering information and storing it carefully, not performing confidence, or just genuinely paying attention. The Vreth Collective's lead speaker opened the session first, a towering creature with 6 articulated limbs and a face that seemed to rearrange itself slightly each time the light shifted, and it addressed the hall in the common galactic tongue, which Sarah's translation chip converted into plain English directly in her ear. The species known as humanity has petitioned for admission to the Galactic Council for the 3rd time in 60 standard years, it said. This body will hear the concerns of all member species today and then vote on whether to grant admission or to issue a permanent exclusion order. Ambassador Voss will be given the opportunity to respond before the vote is formally called. What followed was 2 hours of the thorough criticism any species had received in that hall in recorded history. And the hall had hosted some remarkable arguments over the centuries. The Saranid hegemony went first with their favorite accusation, that humans were emotionally volatile and therefore diplomatically unreliable. They pointed to 3 separate incidents in the last decade where human negotiators had walked out of formal talks, raised their voices in official settings, or made decisions the Saranid described plainly as driven by feeling rather than logic. The Vreth Collective expanded on this by presenting a compiled record of human history, wars across centuries, periods of severe environmental damage, long stretches of mass political instability, and argued that a species with such a recent and ongoing pattern of internal violence could not be trusted with access to shared council infrastructure, defense systems, or interstellar trade agreements. The Dorith Assembly was more direct. They said humanity was simply too young, too unfinished, too raw, like a blade that had not yet been properly tempered, and introducing such a species into council operations risked damaging decisions that affected hundreds of billions of lives across multiple star systems. The Polani Drift raised the issue of technology. Human FTL drives were less efficient than the council standard. Human communication arrays had a shorter operational range. Human terraforming methods were slower and more aggressive toward local ecosystems. They were simply not ready, the Polani said, and admitting them now would mean carrying them rather than working alongside them. 2 smaller species made separate comments about human population growth rates. Unusually fast, and suggested that a species expanding at that pace would eventually become a demographic and resource problem inside any cooperative governing body. Sarah listened to all of it. She stood completely still, datapad held at her side, expression neutral, and she did not interrupt once, did not sigh, did not shift her weight from foot to foot, did not look at the floor or up at the ceiling. She looked at each speaker in turn, giving them the full attention of her dark and steady eyes, the way a person listens when they are genuinely interested in every word, not pretending, just listening. In the observation gallery above the main floor, and her aide Dio sat with the small human support staff and watched her the entire time. And he later told people that watching Sarah Voss stand there during those 2 hours was one of the stranger experiences of his career. She looked like someone sitting in a park on a calm afternoon, watching people walk past, not bothered, not bored, just watching everything. When all the delegations had finished, the ancient council speaker, whose species name was unpronounceable by human vocal cords, and was referred to in Earth documents simply as the eldest, called for the vote in a voice like old wood settling, "All those in favor of granting the human species full membership in the Galactic Council, please register your vote now." The light panel on Sarah's side of the hall remained completely dark. Not one vote came in. "All those in favor of a permanent exclusion order, meaning Earth and all. But territories under human governance will be formally and indefinitely excluded from Council membership, Council trade agreements, and Council military protection. Please register now." 34 lights came on across the panel, bright, fast, and certain. 7 delegates registered abstentions, 0 in favor of admission. The speaker read the numbers into the official record in a flat, careful voice, the way official results are always read, without drama, and then it looked down at Sarah with its enormous, unreadable eyes. "Ambassador Voss, does the human delegation wish to offer a final statement before this result is formally logged?" Sarah looked down at her datapad. She tapped through one screen, then another, and then she closed it with a soft, clean click and tucked it under her arm. She smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, a small, unhurried gesture, and she looked up at the ring of 41 species watching her from their curved seats, and she smiled. It was not a performance of a smile. It was the real thing, small and quiet and entirely self-contained. The kind of smile that belongs to a person who has just confirmed something they already believed was true, and found that they were right. "Understood," she said. "Good luck out there." She turned and walked toward the exit. The hall was absolutely silent. Not the respectful kind of silence, but the stunned kind, the kind that fills a space when something expected simply does not arrive. They had all waited for the argument, the appeal, the passionate speech about humanity's worth and potential, and the anger or the grief. Every other species that had ever been rejected had given them at least one of those things. She gave them none of it. She just walked, her shoes quiet on the black stone floor, her datapad under her arm, her back straight. In the corridor outside the hall, Dio caught up with her at a near run. I'm slightly breathless from taking the stairs instead of waiting for the lift. "Ambassador," he said, "are you all right?" She did not slow down. She kept moving toward the docking bay at the same calm and steady pace she had walked out with. "I'm excellent," she said, "but they excluded us. Permanently. Doesn't that?" "Dio," she said, and she glanced sideways at him with that same small, private smile. "They just gave us the single greatest gift one civilization can give another. Do you know what that is?" He waited. "Freedom from their rules," she said, and she pushed through the docking bay doors and walked toward the ship without looking back. Behind her, in the grand conclave hall of Verath Prime, 41 species sat in their curved seats in silence, and more than a few of them had begun to feel something they could not quite name. Not victory, then not satisfaction. Something more like the uneasy feeling of a person who has just closed a door and is no longer certain they locked the right room. The news reached Earth in the form of a short official transmission from the Varath Prime Station. 17 words in the Galactic Standard format, stamped with the Council seal. I delivered to the UN Interstellar Affairs Building in Nairobi on a Tuesday morning when most of the staff had not yet finished their coffee. The petition of the human species for admission to the Galactic Council has been formally denied. Permanent exclusion order enacted. Director Amara Osei read the transmission twice, set it down on her desk, and then walked to the window of her office on the 14th floor and looked out at the city below. The traffic moving in slow, bright lines through the morning haze, the market vendors setting up their stalls in the square, the old acacia trees along the boulevard that had been there longer than the building itself. She had expected to feel something large when this moment came. Grief, maybe, or anger, or the heavy particular sadness of a door being closed. But what she felt instead was something smaller and stranger, almost like the feeling of a person who has been bracing for a punch that has finally landed and found that they are still standing. Her comm buzzed. It was Ambassador Voss calling from the ship, still in transit back to Earth. "You've seen it?" Sarah asked. "Just now," Amara said. "Good. Call the core team together for when I land. Not the full council, just the 12. And tell them to bring their appetite because we have a great deal of work to do." Amara paused. "You're not upset?" There was a brief silence on the line, thoughtful, not uncomfortable. "I haven't been upset about this for about 2 years," Sarah said, and the line ended. The core team gathered 3 days later in a large conference room on the top floor of the Nairobi building. 12 people, all of them specialists, and all of them chosen over the previous 2 years specifically for this moment. And Sarah stood at the head of the table with a cup of tea and no presentation slides. She explained it simply and directly, the way she always explained things. The Galactic Council, she said, I operated on a framework of rules that had been designed to manage conflict between powerful and established civilizations. Rules that made sense for species that had been in space for thousands of years and needed to protect existing claims, existing trade arrangements, and existing power structures. But for a young species just beginning to expand into the galaxy, those rules were not a shield. They were a cage. Council membership came with trade restrictions. You could only buy from and sell to approved partners at approved rates, with tariffs set by bodies that the older and richer members had far more influence over than the newer and poorer ones. It came with technology restrictions, meaning you could not develop certain types of drives or weapons or communication systems without submitting them to council oversight and approval. And it came with territorial restrictions, some meaning large sections of unclaimed and resource-rich space had been designated as protected or reserved and were entirely off-limits to new members, even if those members had the ships and the means to reach them. Exclusion from the council, Sarah explained. It meant that not one of those rules applied to humanity anymore. "We can trade with anyone," she said. "We can develop any technology we are capable of building. We can make contact with any species we choose. We can settle any unclaimed world the Council has not specifically fenced off, and we owe them nothing in return for any of it." Someone at the table said, "But we have no protection. If a Council member decides to act against us, we have no allies, no legal standing, and no framework to appeal to." Sarah nodded. She had been waiting for exactly that point. "That is why we move fast," she said. "And that is why we move smart. By the time anyone in that council decides we are a threat worth doing something about, we need to already be too connected, too useful, and too widely known to cut off cleanly." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone asked, "How long have you been planning this?" Sarah picked up her tea and looked at the surface of it. "Since the second rejection," she said. 60 years is a long time to think." The work began immediately. Not loudly, not with press conferences or dramatic government announcements, but quietly and with the kind of focused, and sustained energy that humans produce when they have a clear direction and no one telling them to slow down. The first project was the drive. Human faster-than-light technology had always been criticized by the Council as inefficient, and by the Council's own standards, the criticism was fair, because human drives consumed more fuel and required longer calibration cycles than the Council model. But human engineers had long suspected there was a fundamentally different approach available, a one that the Council's existing framework had never pursued because their technology was already good enough, and they had no reason to experiment with something that might not work free from the Council's technology sharing restrictions, which required member species to submit all major research for Council review and approval before development could continue. 3 separate research teams began working simultaneously on what they called internally the ugly drive, not elegant, not optimized for the efficiency metrics the Council cared about, but built for a single purpose, getting somewhere fast, burning whatever was necessary to do it. Within 8 months, they had a working prototype that covered interstellar distances 30% faster than the best Council drive on record. It was loud and fuel-hungry, and the calibration process was something experienced pilots described as aggressive. But humans had always been unusually good at finding fuel. 30% faster was not a number anyone was inclined to complain about. The second project was contact. The Council's non-contact preservation orders covered dozens of species across the galaxy. Civilizations classified by the Council as too young or too unstable for interstellar interaction, placed under a kind of protective quarantine that prevented any member species from making official contact with them. And for years, human xenologists had quietly suspected that several of these orders had less to do with genuine protection and considerably more to do with keeping certain resource-rich systems out of reach for anyone outside the Council's preferred inner circle. Humanity reached out to 3 of them. The first was the Daha'al, a reclusive species living in a gas giant system at the edge of what Council maps labeled the Quiet Zone. They had been listed under a preservation order for 60 years, and which was particularly strange because the Dahal had been capable of spaceflight for 80. The preservation order, investigation revealed, had been issued in the same year. A Council survey team discovered large deposits of a rare mineral in the Dahal home system that was essential for stabilizing high-output drive cores. The second were the merchant clans of the Outer Fringe, not a unified species at all, but a loose and lively network of a dozen small civilizations who had been trading among themselves for centuries without any Council involvement whatsoever. They carried no preservation order, just a formal Council classification of non-strategic, meaning the Council had simply never considered them worth the administrative effort. They were, in the words of the Fringe clan elder who received the first human contact message, extremely pleased to have new customers. The third contact was the one that would cause the most significant trouble later. But at this stage it was made quietly, carefully, and the details were kept strictly within the core team. The third project surprised the wider scientific community when word began to leak out, because it was not a weapon, not a defensive system, not even a new class of ship. It was a library, humanity's research institutions, but freed from the Council's data-sharing restrictions, which required member species to submit all major scientific work for Council review before it could be published or shared outside their own borders, began releasing everything openly, to everyone, with no conditions, no fees, no agreements required, and no limits on how it could be used: physics research, medical data, terraforming methods for low-atmosphere worlds, agricultural techniques for low-gravity environments, atmospheric processing models developed during Earth's own environmental recovery programs. All of it went out across the galactic open network with human contact information at the top and a single simple header: from Earth to anyone who finds it useful. The Council had expected, after the vote, that humanity would spend the following months in the diplomatic equivalent of mourning, reduced, quiet, humbled, perhaps beginning the long process of adjusting to life as an excluded and unprotected species on the edge of a galaxy that had officially decided it did not want them. Instead, within 6 months of the exclusion vote, human ships were docking at fringe stations that had never seen an Earth vessel. Human researchers were corresponding directly with scientists from 4 non-council species, and a council intelligence officer stationed near the outer edge of human territory had just finished writing the longest and most carefully worded report of his career. It was full of data, observation logs, communication intercepts, and detailed analysis. But its conclusion fit in a single short sentence: "We made a mistake." At the outer fringe station of Calith Vor, but Ambassador Voss sat across a wide, low table from the eldest of the Da'al Trade Council, a being that looked something like a large and very calm octopus constructed from polished copper, and pressed her thumb to the ratification pad on humanity's first fully independent trade agreement. The elder watched her with its cluster of small, dark eyes as the pad registered the signature and glowed briefly green. And then it asked her something in its own language, which the translation rendered as, "Why do you give so much away?" Sarah looked up from the pad and thought about the question genuinely, not performing consideration, actually thinking, "Because the more people who thrive," she said, "the harder we are to stop." The elder held very still for a long moment. Then it made a sound that the translator rendered as "yes," but which the Da'al used specifically to mean something closer to, "I understand now, and I wish I had understood this sooner." The trouble started at the border of a system called Veth Karath, a small and rocky collection of planets at the outer edge of council-controlled space, home to a species called the Murath, who had been council members for about 200 years. They were not powerful members, not wealthy ones, not influential ones, but they were loyal. They paid their dues on time. They followed the rules without much complaint. And they mostly stayed out of the larger arguments that the bigger species conducted in the council chambers. The Murath had a neighbor, a species called the Sokol, who were not council members and had never been invited to become them. And for most of those 200 years, the relationship between the two species had been one of quiet, managed tension, held in check primarily by the fact that the Sokol knew very well that attacking a council member meant a council military response. And a council military response was something the Sokol were in no position to survive. That calculation began to change in the 9th month after humanity's exclusion. A Sokol patrol ship fired on a Murath mining vessel in disputed orbital territory around the 2nd planet of the Veth Karath system. This was not unusual in itself. Border incidents of that kind had happened before. Warning shots and aggressive posturing were part of the long, low-grade friction of that particular dispute. But what happened next was very unusual. The Sokol patrol did not pull back after the warning shot. It pushed forward, and when Murath defense ships arrived to respond, the Sokol vessels held their position and kept firing, and the engagement continued for 11 hours, which was 11 hours longer than any previous Sokol aggression had lasted. And before the Murath finally called for council military backup. When the council's response coordinator began reviewing the engagement data the following morning, he found something that stopped him mid-report. The Sokol ships were equipped with a shield modulation system he had never seen before. It was not in any council database, not in any allied registry, not in any intercepted fringe technical documentation. It was new, it was working extremely well, and it was reducing the effectiveness of Murath weapons fire at a rate that should not have been possible for a species with the Sokol's known technology base. He traced the system's origins in 4 days. It had come from a paper published 7 months earlier by a research team at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, Earth, posted freely to the Galactic Open Network under the title Adaptive Field Harmonics in Multi-Layer Shielding, a New Framework. The Sokol had found it, read it, adapted it to their own hardware, built functioning units, and deployed them in active combat in under half a year. The coordinator sat with that information for a long time before he began writing his report. In the council chambers on Verith Prime, the report produced a reaction that ranged from sharp alarm to genuine fury depending on which delegation you were watching. The Soranid Hegemony's delegate, the same gray-skinned, a three-eyed figure who had stood at the exclusion hearing and argued with great confidence that humanity was too primitive to contribute meaningfully to galactic affairs, requested a private session with the Council's Science Advisory Board the same afternoon the report was circulated. The session lasted 3 hours. It ended with the board's chair making a personal notation that she later described to a colleague as deeply uncomfortable to write. The Pretoria paper was not merely good. It was the kind of good that made 3 existing council research projects look as though they had been moving in the wrong direction for a significant number of years, and the Shield paper was not the only one. In the 9 months since the exclusion vote, Earth's institutions had released over 400 open-access research documents covering physics, medicine, environmental engineering, agricultural science, drive mechanics, and atmospheric processing, and non-council species across the fringe had been reading them, using them, and building with them at a pace the council had not anticipated and was not prepared for 3 smaller council member species. The Alaveth, the Doran Compact, and the Harath had been doing this quietly, citing human research in their own internal documents without flagging it to the Council's knowledge-sharing office, and which they were technically not required to do since the material was not of Council origin. When this was discovered during a routine audit, the Vreth Collective called for a formal review of the knowledge-sharing protocols. The review opened up a much larger argument than the Vreth had intended, because in the process of examining what member species had been reading and using, the Council discovered something considerably more uncomfortable. Several of its own members had been in active correspondence with human researchers for months, and at least 2 of those correspondences had produced collaborative scientific results that the member species had not disclosed to Council administration. The argument in the chambers became loud, and stayed loud for days. Out in the fringe, meanwhile, the effects of humanity's open publishing program were becoming visible in ways that data reports could describe but not fully convey. The Sokol were not the only ones who had adapted human shield technology. At least 4 other small fringe species had done the same, and one of them, a quiet mining civilization called the Hethari, had used a set of human terraforming papers to begin converting a previously uninhabitable moon into a functioning agricultural world. The Hethari had been classified by the Council as resource-dependent and non-strategic for generations, a classification that, in practice, meant the Council had decided they were too poor and too small to be worth investing in, and had quietly assumed that the Hethari would always need to purchase food from Council suppliers at Council-set prices. The moon changed that. When the Council's Trade Modeling Office ran their updated projections after receiving reports of the Hethari terraforming project, they found that a self-sufficient Hethari food supply would reduce Council agricultural export revenue by a measurable amount over the next 15 years. Not catastrophic, but significant. And more importantly, and it was a clear demonstration of a pattern that was showing up in trade data across a dozen fringe systems simultaneously. The pattern was this: humanity was making small species self-sufficient, and self-sufficient species needed Council goods less. The Council Trade Committee drafted an economic sanctions package targeting Earth, restricting human access to Council-controlled trade corridors and resource markets, on a move designed to cut off the oxygen supply to humanity's expanding network before it grew any larger. The package was written, circulated among delegations, and scheduled for a vote. Then someone in the economics office ran the full impact analysis. The analysis revealed that human trade routes had quietly become woven into fringe commerce in ways that made clean separation significantly more complicated than anyone had assumed. Human ships were carrying cargo for non-council species, who were in turn carrying cargo for council member species. And the whole arrangement had grown into a web of interdependencies that would take months to map and considerably longer to unwind. Cutting Earth out of that web would cause disruptions that would cost council member economies more, in the short term, than it would cost humanity. The sanctions vote was postponed indefinitely. The hawkish faction within the council, led by the Saranid hegemony and two of the larger military powers, and growing louder and more impatient with each passing week, began pushing for a different kind of response, not a trade measure, not a legal challenge, not another formal communication that humanity would receive politely and ignore with a smile, a show of force, a fleet deployment to the edge of human territory, large enough to make clear that the Council still had both the capability and the will to act when its interests were threatened. Admiral Veth Soranid, of the hegemony's most senior military commander, was asked to prepare a full threat assessment and an operational recommendation. He spent 2 weeks on it. The document he submitted was not what the hawkish faction wanted. It was careful, honest, and methodical, and it said plainly that while a fleet deployment was operationally feasible, the picture on the ground had changed considerably since the exclusion vote 9 months earlier. And any action against Earth now needed to account for the following facts. Humanity had developed new FTL capabilities that no current council tracking system could reliably follow. They had established working relationships with at least 11 non-council species across the fringe, and they had, this was the line that the Admiral had rewritten 4 times before leaving it in, been constructing something large in neutral fringe space for at least 6 months, the purpose of which had not yet been determined by any intelligence source available to him. He recommended against immediate action and requested more time and better intelligence. The hawkish faction pushed back in language that made the session recorder uncomfortable to read back afterward. They called him overcautious. They said the council needed to act before the situation moved further beyond their control. And they said hesitation was itself a form of weakness. Veth Soranid looked at them across the table with the expression of a person who has been patient for a very long time and is not quite finished being patient yet. "None of us know what they are building out there," he said, "and I find that considerably more concerning than everything else in this file combined." In a small bar on the coast of Portugal, wooden chairs, salt air coming through open windows. At the sound of water somewhere close, a retired Earth Admiral named Castillo sat across a scratched table from a young council diplomat who had come a very long way to ask questions he was not sure he was authorized to ask. The diplomat's name was Feneth, his species was Aranid, and he had come unofficially. His delegation did not know he was here, his supervisor did not know he was here, and he had used 4 days of accumulated annual leave to make the journey. Because after 9 months of watching the Council react to humanity with increasing confusion and decreasing confidence, he had decided that the most useful thing he could do was come and simply ask. He asked the Admiral what humanity wanted, what the actual goal was, what Earth was working toward, what the end of this road looked like from the human side. Castillo looked at him for a moment and then ordered 2 drinks and set them both on the table between them and looked out at the water. "We spent 60 years trying to get a seat at your table," he said. "We asked 3 times, we prepared, we met every standard they moved every time we got close. And you kept saying no." Feneth waited. "So we're done with that," Castillo said, and he picked up his drink and leaned back in his chair. "We don't want your seat at your table anymore." "Then what do you want?" Feneth asked Castillo, looked at him with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who has had the answer ready for a long time and has simply been waiting for the right person to ask. "We're building a bigger table," he said, and he turned back to the water and said nothing else for a while. And Feneth sat across from him in the salt air and thought about that answer for a very long time. The station did not look like a weapon, and that was the first thing every council intelligence analyst wrote in their reports when the long-range scans to finally came back clear enough to read. It looked like a city Hearthstone station sat in the neutral band of space between the Council's outermost territories and the inner fringe systems, a region that Council maps marked with the single dismissive notation of unregulated, and it was large in a way that communicated sustained effort rather than sudden ambition. It had been built in pieces over many months, and by ships from at least 6 different species, different sections arriving at different intervals, assembled by crews who did not share a common language, but had learned to work together through a combination of translation technology, hand-drawn technical diagrams, and the universal language of pointing at something broken and then at the tool that would fix it. The design was not unified in the way that Council stations were unified. With their clean, symmetrical arms and matching hull plates and sense of everything having been approved by the same committee, Hearthstone looked assembled, in the best possible sense of the word, as though people with different ideas had all been told their ideas were welcome and had taken that seriously. There were sections with the round, smooth profiles favored by doll engineers, sections with the angular, practical geometry that human construction teams defaulted to when nobody was asking them to be elegant, sections with the dense, layered cluster architecture of the fringe merchant clans who built the way they traded, fitting as much as possible into every available space, and at the center, one large hub section that had been designed collaboratively by all of them together, which was the reason it looked like nothing any single species had produced before, and also the reason it worked better than any of them had individually predicted. The station had no hierarchy chamber, no single large room arranged to seat a governing body in order of importance, with the most powerful delegates closest to the center and the least powerful ones arranged by rank along the outer edges. The intelligence reports noted this detail carefully, and the analysts were divided on whether it was a significant philosophical statement or simply an oversight. It was not an oversight. Ambassador Sarah Voss had not slept properly in 4 days by the time the opening ceremony began. Not because she was anxious about it, but because the list of things requiring her attention had not been getting shorter at the rate she had hoped, and she had a long-established habit of staying awake rather than sleeping when a list was winning. She stood at the main observation window of the central hub on the morning of the opening and watched the ships arrive. There were human vessels, cargo ships and science ships, and a small honor escort from the UN Interstellar Fleet. Their hulls freshly painted in the deep blue that the fleet had adopted for formal occasions, and there were Da'al ships with their distinctive copper-colored hull plating, and fringe merchant carriers with their layered, overloaded silhouettes, and 3 ships from the Alaveth, who had formally withdrawn their council membership 2 weeks earlier in a polite statement that the council had acknowledged and then declined to discuss publicly. And there was one other ship, smaller than the rest, moving carefully and a little slowly into the docking berth at the station's eastern arm. And when Sarah saw it, she felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite sadness and was not quite pride and was somewhere between the two in the place where important things tend to live. That was the Ilokan vessel. The Ilokan were the species that human contact teams had reached out to quietly in the 2nd month after the exclusion vote, the ones the council had placed under a preservation order, and their story was, in Sarah's considered opinion, the clearest and most honest example of what the council's framework had become when no one was examining it carefully. The Ilokan were not primitive. They had been a spacefaring species for 30 years, which was less time than humanity, but a very real and meaningful capability. They were intelligent and curious and deeply capable of managing their own affairs. As 30 years of successful independent space operations demonstrated plainly, the Council's preservation order on their system had not been placed because they needed protection. It had been placed because their home system sat directly adjacent to a trade route that the Doran Compact had been attempting to claim exclusive commercial rights to for decades. Beyond a spacefaring Ilokan species with legal standing in that region would complicate that claim considerably, So the council had classified the Illican as pre-technological in their official records, which was simply and demonstrably not true, and issued a non-contact order that prevented any member species from acknowledging them as what they actually were for 30 years. Now, the Illican had watched ships move through the nearby space lanes and received no explanation for why no one stopped. When the first human contact vessel arrived and opened a channel, the Illican response had come back within minutes. Not in surprise, not in fear or confusion, but in what the human translator rendered as the closest available equivalent of a single word. Finally. They were here at Hearthstone now, docked in the eastern arm, in a berth built specifically to their ship's specifications months before they had agreed to come. And in the days ahead they would be introduced to the wider galaxy not as subjects of a preservation order, not as a protected primitive curiosity, but as themselves, on their own terms. And with full information about who everyone was and what was happening around them, the Council's official delegation arrived on the third day. They had requested access by citing a general clause in the Interspecies Stability Charter that technically permitted Council observers to visit any large installation operating in neutral space. And Sarah had approved the request immediately, without conditions or delays, and had sent a warm and detailed welcome message that the delegation's senior member had read twice before deciding he could not find anything in it to object to 3 delegates, 2 observers, and a security detail arrived at the docking bay. The security detail was politely asked to leave their weapons on their ship, as which they did after a pause long enough to make their feelings about the request clear without being long enough to constitute an actual refusal. Sarah met them personally and conducted the tour herself. She took them through the science wing first, along a well-lit corridor of shared workspaces where researchers from 5 different species were working on joint projects at benches designed to accommodate a range of body types and working heights, communicating through translation tech and the kind of patient, enthusiastic pantomime that scientists fall into naturally when they are trying to show another person something genuinely exciting. She took them through the medical center, staffed by human doctors, the 2 Dahal biologists whose approach to cellular repair was producing outcomes that the human doctors found remarkable, and 2 fringe healers whose techniques for managing bone density loss in low-gravity long-haul crews had already been adopted voluntarily by 3 human fleet operators. She took them through the open market on the station's second ring, where fringe merchants sold goods that no council supplier catalog included, at prices set entirely by the sellers, with no council tariff structure applied at any point in the transaction, and where the noise and the color and the sheer variety of things on offer had the effect of making the council's carefully managed trade framework feel, by comparison, very quiet and very small. And then she walked them to the entrance of the community hall and stopped and let them look. The hall was the largest open space on the station, high-ceilinged, warm-lit, full of the particular productive noise of many different kinds of people occupying the same space by choice. And what was inside it was, by any standard the Council used to measure readiness for interstellar contact, impossible. Illican researchers were sitting with fringe traders, and sharing a meal and trading small objects back and forth with the careful interest of people discovering what the other one considers valuable, species that the Council had classified as incompatible or unprepared, were doing what people do when they are given time and a place, and someone who treats the interaction as normal. One of the Council delegates, a careful and experienced woman from the Palani Drift who had spent 30 years managing formal interspecies relations protocols, stood in the doorway of the community hall and did not speak for a very long time. "How?" she said, finally. Not a complete question, just the word, directed at no one in particular. "We asked them," Sarah said. "We gave them information, and time, and a place. And they did everything else themselves." Feneth arrived at Hearthstone on the 4th day, but not as part of the official council delegation. He came on a small private transport, using 5 days of annual leave. Carrying a secure data drive in his coat pocket that he had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to bring, and he found Sarah in a side room off the main corridor, asked the station's directory system for her location with the specific phrasing of someone who has rehearsed the conversation they are about to have, and handed her the drive without a speech. "The hardline faction is not going to accept this," he said. Meaning the station, meaning all of it, meaning everything she had built. "They have been meeting privately for 6 weeks, and they are planning an operational response. I cannot tell you exactly what, because I do not know exactly what. But the fleet movement requests in this data are not consistent with any scheduled exercise." Sarah took the drive and looked at it. She looked up at Faneth, at his young face, and at the specific exhaustion of someone who has made a decision they know they cannot take back. And she nodded slowly. "You know what you have done by coming here," she said, meaning the risk, meaning all of it. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it completely and without qualification. She called her core team together that evening, the same 12 from Nairobi, then plus several people who had earned their place in the 2 years since, and briefed them on the contents of the drive. When she finished, the room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone knew was coming has finally arrived and turned out to be exactly as large as expected. She looked around at all of them, at the faces of people who had spent 2 years building something they believed in, and the small and private smile that had been her public face since the day of the exclusion vote was not there. What was on her face instead was something older and clearer and harder, the expression of a person who has known a moment was coming since the beginning and has been preparing for it in every decision made since. "They are coming," she said, "and that is all right. Let them come. Let them see what they are actually dealing with." She paused. "Not us," she said, and she gestured at the walls of the station, meaning everything beyond them, meaning all of it. "This." The Council fleet came out of FTL at the edge of the neutral band on a Thursday morning. 14 warships, 3 carriers, and a command vessel that was, by volume, larger than Hearthstone Station itself. And the human sensor post that picked them up first sent an alert to the station in under 30 seconds. Sarah was already awake. She had been awake for most of the night, not out of fear and not quite out of anxiety, but out of the particular kind of alertness that arrives when something you have been preparing for over a long period of time is finally close enough to feel. The way a person wakes up early on the day of something important, not because an alarm goes off, but because their body already knows. She dressed, drank her coffee standing at the small window of her quarters while the stars outside held their position, and walked to the command center with the same unhurried pace she had walked out of the Grand Conclave Hall 2 years and 4 months earlier. The station was not panicking. That was the first thing she observed, and it produced in her a quiet and genuine pride. The crew was moving with calm efficiency through protocols they had practiced many times, communicating in short, clear exchanges, their faces focused without being afraid. On the main screen, the fleet was visible as a long, dark formation holding position at the edge of the neutral band, not advancing, not transmitting anything yet, and simply present, and Sarah recognized the behavior immediately because she had read every account she could find of how Council fleet commanders operated when they arrived somewhere and found it different from what they had expected. They gathered information first. "How many partner vessels have confirmed position?" she asked the comms officer, a young Aranid woman named Sela, who had transferred from a fringe station 8 months ago and had become, in that time, and one of the best communications officers Sarah had worked with, ran through the confirmed list without rushing. 14 species had checked in and confirmed their position near the station. Ships from the Da'al, from the fringe merchant clans, from the Alaveth, from the Doran Compact, which had withdrawn its council membership 3 weeks earlier, from the Hathari, from the Ilokan, who had no warships but had sent their two fastest scout vessels because they had been told what might happen and had decided without hesitation that they wanted to be present, and from 8 other species whose names had not appeared in any council report 2 years ago, because 2 years ago no one had been paying attention to them. The relay? Sarah asked. Active and broadcasting from all confirmed nodes, Sella said. Coverage at 94% of projected range and stable. Sarah nodded and looked at the screen. The relay network was the thing that had worried Admiral Veth Soranid in his threat assessment, and that the hawkish faction had dismissed as probably a trade communications system. The thing that had been described in Council intelligence reports, with varying degrees of accuracy, and not one of them with full understanding of what it actually was. It was a communications network, a system of relay nodes that humanity and its partners had been placing quietly across a broad section of the galaxy over the previous 18 months, carried and positioned by ships using the new fast drives that Council tracking systems could follow on paper but rarely managed to keep up with in practice. And what the network did was simple. And the implications of what it did were not simple at all. It made communication instantaneous. Any signal sent through the relay reached every connected node at the same moment, which meant that what was happening in the neutral band right now was visible in real time. To species and stations spread across a region of space that had previously been separated by days or weeks of communication lag. The Council fleet's arrival was being watched simultaneously by 11 species who were not in this system. Any action the fleet took would happen in front of all of them at once, together. That with no delay, no opportunity for a careful official version of events to travel ahead of the real one, no window in which the story could be shaped before the witnesses compared notes. Fleet Commander Serath Vorn of the Soranid Hegemony sat in his command chair and did not speak for a long time after the full sensor picture resolved on his display. He had arrived expecting to find a station with a reasonable human defensive presence and perhaps a few allied vessels, a visible show of this support, meaningful but manageable, something that could be framed in his operational report as a provocation that had justified a measured response. He had not expected 14 species. He had not expected that the moment his fleet completed its FTL emergence sequence, his communications officer had reported an immediate spike in relay traffic across a network that his intelligence files described as purpose uncertain, signals traveling outward in all directions simultaneously, reaching destinations his tracking systems could not identify, which meant that whoever was receiving those signals knew the fleet was here before his own carrier group had finished its standard post-jump diagnostics. He requested a full registry analysis of every vessel in the formation around Hearthstone. The analysis came back in 12 minutes. Most of the vessels he recognized: Da'al, Fringe, Alaveth. But one section of the report made him sit forward in his chair and read it a second time, and then a third. The Doran compact ships in the formation were carrying active compact military registry numbers, not commercial designations, not research classifications, military registries, meaning these were compact warships, and the Doran compact had been a council member species until 3 weeks ago. He requested confirmation. The confirmation matched. He sat back and looked at the formation on his screen for a long time, at the number of ships, at the variety of species they represented, at the relay traffic still moving steadily outward from the station to places he could not account for. And he thought about Admiral Veth Soranid's report, and which he had read and privately agreed with and had not said so aloud in the faction meetings because the room had not been one where agreement with caution was received. Well, he opened a channel to Hearthstone Station. Hearthstone Station, this is Fleet Commander Serath Vorn of the Soranid Hegemony, representing the Galactic Council. You are operating a large, unauthorized installation in neutral space. and this fleet has been deployed to formally request your cooperation with a council review of this facility and its compliance with the Interspecies Stability Charter." Sarah's voice came back clear and unhurried. "Commander Sarath Vorn, welcome to Hearthstone. I'm Ambassador Sarah Voss. The station has been open to observers since our first day of operation, and that has not changed. We currently have a council delegation on board who I am sure would be glad to speak with you directly. And if you would like to come aboard yourself, you are welcome to bring whoever you choose." A pause. "Ambassador, the council has significant concerns about the nature and scope of what is being operated here." "I would be very glad to address those concerns in person," Sarah said, "with full transparency and full access to any part of this station. That offer is open to you, to your crew, and to every ship in your formation." A longer pause, the kind of pause in which a great many things are being weighed simultaneously. Sarath Vorn looked at his tactical display one more time, at the Allied vessels around the station, at the relay traffic indicators still active and steady, at the Doran compact warships with their military registries, and at a formation that was not positioned aggressively, but was positioned completely. And he made the decision that he later wrote in his personal account was the only rational one the situation allowed. "We will stand down from active posture," he said, "and formally request a diplomatic meeting." "We will have the room ready," Sarah said. "On Vareth Prime," and the session that opened in the council chambers following Sarath Vorn's stand-down was the loudest and longest the hall had hosted in living memory of any species present. The hawkish faction called it a surrender and demanded a different commander be sent with clearer orders. The moderate bloc called it a necessary recognition of a changed reality. 3 member species called it, in carefully worded formal statements that nonetheless communicated their meaning without ambiguity. At the moment they had been waiting for to raise questions they had been holding for months. Within 7 days of the stand-down, the Alaveth's withdrawal from the council was formally processed and acknowledged. The Doran compacts followed 2 days later. And then, without announcement or ceremony, 2 smaller member species simply stopped responding to council administrative communications, their representatives quietly unavailable, their offices closed. The structure did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. Large structures rarely do. It did what they do when they have been undermined from the inside over a long period of time. It settled, slowly and with the quiet grinding sound of weight finding a new distribution, into a different shape. The council did not end. It continued to exist, diminished and reduced, and no longer certain of its own edges. But it was no longer the only framework available in the galaxy, and that fact, once it was fully understood, changed the calculation for every species that had been a member more out of necessity than conviction. 6 weeks after Sarath Vorn's stand-down, Ambassador Sarah Voss submitted her formal resignation from the post she had held through the exclusion vote, through the 2 years of building, and through the morning the fleet had arrived and had stood down, and nominated her deputy, a sharp and capable woman named Lena Adeyemi, as her replacement. She packed the contents of her office into a single bag, she had never accumulated much, and walked the station one last time, slowly, without a schedule. She stopped in the community hall and sat down at an empty table near the back and watched an Ilocon researcher was showing a human engineer something on a handheld screen, both of them leaning forward with the focused, a slightly breathless energy of people who are in the middle of figuring something out together and can tell they are getting close. At the next table, a Da'al elder was teaching a fringed child a game that involved small, smooth stones arranged in a pattern on the table surface. The child kept making the wrong move, and the elder kept resetting the stones and starting over with a patience that showed no sign of running low near the entrance. The Feneth was standing with 3 people whose species Sarah needed an extra moment to identify, and he was laughing. The full, unself-conscious laugh of someone who is somewhere they did not expect to be and has decided they are glad Sarah sat there for a long time. Lena found her eventually and sat down across from her without asking permission, which Sarah had always liked about her. "Before you go," Lena said, "I need to ask you something. What would you have done if they had admitted us? It's at the very beginning. If the vote had gone the other way." Sarah looked around the community hall, at all of it, at the Illican and the engineer and the elder and the child and Feneth, and the dozens of others moving through the space with the particular ease of people who belong somewhere, and she thought about the question the way she always thought about hard questions, which was completely and without rushing herself. Probably followed their rules for a generation or two, she said. Worked within the system, tried to make things a little better from the inside. Maybe it would have worked, maybe it would have been too slow. Hard to say. Lena waited. Sarah picked up her bag. "Guess we'll never know," she said. And the small, private smile came back, as natural as breathing, as if it had simply been waiting for a reason. She stood up and walked through the community hall toward the docking bay, past the Illican researcher and the human engineer, past the Da'al elder and the fringe child who had finally made the right move with the stones, and was looking up with an expression of pure delight past Feneth and his new friends. And the hall kept doing what it had been doing since the first day it opened, which was exist as a place where anyone could arrive and find room. The Galactic Council had voted to exclude humanity from the galaxy's future. As it turned out, humanity had simply gone ahead and built one.